What Katy did. The Carr family. Katy Carr was 12 years old. She lived in a large white house on the edge of a small town in America. There were 6 children in Katy's family, 4 girls and 2 boys, and Katy was the oldest. The children's mama had died when Katy was 8. The children's father, Papa, was a dear, kind man. He was a doctor and was always busy looking after sick people. Sometimes he was away from home all day and sometimes half the night. Papa's sister, Aunt Izzy, had come to take care of the family when Mama died. She wasn't as gentle or as pretty as Mama. She was much older and had a rather sharp face. Papa liked to see his girls and boys enjoying themselves, playing rough-and-tumble games, but Aunt Izzy wasn't used to boisterous children. She wished they would just sit quietly and read or sew. But Katy wasn't the sort of girl who could sit still for long. She was forever rushing about, her head full of adventures. Katy was tall for her age, with long hair which never stayed tidy for long. Her best friend Cece was quite the opposite. She was a pretty girl who was always neatly dressed. How Katy longed to be like Cece. But poor Katy was always getting into trouble, mostly because she was so untidy and careless. She would often daydream about doing something really brave, like saving a child from drowning. Then she would become famous, and everyone would admire her. Once, when she was only 6, Katy found a little girl in the street. Katy thought she must be an orphan. She wanted to look after the little girl, so she took her home and hid her in the attic. But the orphan was frightened of the dark. In the middle of the night, she woke up, screaming. Mama and Papa had to take the poor little girl back to her mother, who had been very worried about her. Katy's sisters were called Clover, Elsie, and Joanna. Clover, who was nearly 11, was a sweet, plump girl. She had big blue eyes and thick plaits of light brown hair. Katy and Clover were very close. Elsie was 8 years old. She was a thin child with dark eyes and short, curly hair. Poor Elsie always seemed to be the odd one out in the family. She was too old to play with the little ones, and Katy and Clover thought her too childish for their grown-up games. Joanna, the youngest of the sisters, was 5. She was quite a tomboy. Everyone called her John or Johnny. Katy's brothers were Dory, a pale, solemn boy of 6, and Phil, a handsome 4-year-old. With such a big family to look after, Aunt Izzy certainly had her hands full. On wet days, the children would run across the backyard to the barn. In the middle of the barn, there was a tall wooden post with steps all the way up. The children climbed up the post to the loft. This was their favorite place to play in wet weather. The loft was long and low and quite dark and dusty. There were lots of cobwebs too, but the children didn't mind. They would all sit in a circle while Katy read one of her stories. She was always writing tales of adventure or romance. Then the children took turns to tell stories of their own or to sing their favorite songs. Behind the barn, there was a big garden full of vegetables and a pasture where 4 cows grazed. The children spent many happy hours there. At the far end of the pasture was a small thicket of trees and bushes. The children called this place Paradise. Here, they could play to their heart's content, away from Aunt Izzy's watchful eye. One sunny Saturday morning, the children went to Paradise to have a picnic. Katy and Cece led the way, and the others followed. Dory and John were laden with great leafy branches. Katy and Cece had each been carrying a wicker picnic basket. These they put down in the shade of a large poplar tree. Then, they all helped to build a shelter with the branches brought by Dory and John. When it was time to eat, the children crowded together in the shelter. Katy opened the picnic baskets. What a feast met their eyes. Aunt Izzy certainly knew how to feed hungry children. She had made 2 kinds of sandwiches, and there were hard-boiled eggs, ginger cakes, and cookies. But best of all were 7 little molasses pies, each with a crisp, sugary top. How good everything tasted! The fresh wind rustled the leaves, the sun was shining, and the birds sang. No grown-up dinner party was ever so much fun. In no time at all, every crumb had disappeared. The children licked their sticky fingers, then lay in the long, cool grass or climbed into the wide branches of the poplar tree. How lovely it was to stretch out in the shade and watch the butterflies flitting from flower to flower. But all too soon, the hours slipped by, and it was time to pack up the picnic baskets and return home. It had been a truly delightful day. The following week, Katy had a dreadful day. Nothing seemed to go right for her. First of all, she was late for school because the ribbon had come off her bonnet. She had tried to pin it in place, but Aunt Izzy had insisted on sewing it back on. By the time Katy and Clover arrived at Miss Knight's school for girls, they were late for the first lesson. "It's all Aunt Izzy's fault," muttered Katy. Miss Knight gave her a black mark for being late, and another one for her untidy writing. When the bell rang for playtime, Katy couldn't wait to run outside. Next to the playground was another girls' school, Miss Miller's. The Knight girls and the Miller girls were sworn enemies. Katy sat up on the woodshed roof. She could see into the Miller playground from there. Suddenly, a gust of wind lifted Katy's bonnet, which she hadn't bothered to tie on properly, and carried it over the fence. Katy stared in horror as her bonnet landed in the middle of the Miller school playground. At any minute, the Miller girls would appear. Katy could imagine the fun they would have with her bonnet, dancing around it, waving it in the air, even using it as a football. Quickly, Katy jumped down from the woodshed and climbed over the fence. She ran across the playground, snatched the bonnet, then raced back to the fence. She scrambled back just as the Miller girls poured into the playground. Her friends crowded round her, cheering and patting her on the back. After so much excitement, the rest of the morning seemed very dull. So, as soon as Miss Knight had gone home for her lunch, Katy invented a game to play in the classroom. Each girl was a river, and Katy was Father Ocean. The rivers ran up and down between the rows of desks. Father Ocean leapt up and down on Miss Knight's platform, roaring loudly. Every now and then, Katy would shout, "Now for a meeting of the waters." Then all the rivers would turn and run, scrambling and screaming towards the ocean. The girls had a marvelous time, rushing up and down, screaming at the tops of their voices. But what a dreadful noise they were making. Even people going past in the street stopped to ask what was going on. When Miss Knight returned, she was startled to see that a crowd had gathered outside the school. She hurried up the steps and threw open the door. The classroom was in an uproar, with chairs overturned, desks pushed to one side, and ink spilled on the floor. There were books scattered everywhere. When the rivers saw Miss Knight, they came to a sudden halt. Only Father Ocean still roared and leapt about on the platform. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Miss Knight. At the sound of her voice, Katy froze. Her heart gave a thump. "It was my idea to play this game," she admitted in a small voice. Miss Knight was furious. The girls felt terribly ashamed, especially Katy. Miss Knight had some very stern words to say to all of them. Then she stood over the girls while they cleared up the mess they had made. That night, Katy told Papa all about her dreadful day. "Papa," she asked, "why is it that on some days everything seems to go wrong? If Aunt Izzy hadn't made me late for school, I'm sure I wouldn't have got into so many scrapes." Papa asked what Aunt Izzy had done to make Katy late. Katy told him about her bonnet ribbon. "So, Katy, my dear," he said, smiling, "if you had mended the ribbon yourself last night, none of this would have happened. Don't you know the old saying, 'for the want of a nail'?" Katy hadn't heard it before, so Papa told her, "For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For the want of a horse, the rider was lost. For the want of a rider, the battle was lost. For the want of a battle, the kingdom was lost, and all for the want of a horseshoe nail." "Oh, Papa," exclaimed Katy, "I shall never, ever forget that." But it wasn't long before Katy did forget. A week later, Katy was in disgrace again. Aunt Izzy had gone out for the evening. Papa was also out visiting patients, so Katy was in charge. Aunt Izzy had told her to be sure that the children were all in bed by 9 o'clock. At first, everything went smoothly. After supper, Katy got Phil ready for bed. He was soon tucked up and fast asleep. But then, the children decided to play kikari. Kikari was a sort of hide-and-seek in the dark. Aunt Izzy had forbidden the children to play this particular game. But Papa had never said they mustn't play it, and Katy always paid more attention to Papa than to Aunt Izzy. It wasn't long before the game became more and more boisterous. Chairs and tables were knocked over as the children stumbled about in the darkness. Then, Clover thought it would be a splendid idea to hide on the mantelpiece. When Katy caught hold of a foot, she couldn't imagine where it had come from. Of course, the children were enjoying themselves too much to notice the mess they were making. Then, suddenly, above all the noise in the nursery, Katy heard the sound of the carriage door slamming. Aunt Izzy! To her horror, Katy realized that it was 10 o'clock. At once, the children fled to their bedrooms. Aunt Izzy came quietly upstairs. Dory and John were snoring rather noisily, she thought, and their beds looked strangely lumpy. She pulled back the bedspreads. Both children were fully clothed. They even had their shoes on. Aunt Izzy looked ready to explode. She made Dory and John undress while she stood over them like an angry dragon. Then she tucked them into bed. Elsie was lying on top of her bed. She was still dressed too, but no amount of shaking would wake her. Aunt Izzy stormed into the room, shared by Katy and Clover. They were both in tears as Aunt Izzy scolded them. The next morning, Katy wept even more when Papa spoke very seriously to her. He reminded her of the time when Mama died. She had said, "Katy must be a mama to the little ones when she grows up." Papa said he thought the time had come. Katy was old enough now to look after her brothers and sisters. As for Kikeri, it was never played again. The long summer holiday had just begun when the Carr family had some exciting news. "Cousin Helen is coming to stay for a few days," announced Aunt Izzy. Cousin Helen. The children had often been told about her, but they had never met her. She was an invalid. She couldn't walk, but had to lie on a sofa day after day. Papa visited her twice a year and often talked about her. "She is such a good, kind person," he said. "Although she is often in great pain, she never complains or grumbles. She thinks only of other people all the time. You should all try to be like her," he added, looking at Katy in particular. When Helen's carriage arrived, the children felt a little shy, but Helen called them to her in a bright, cheery voice and gave them all warm hugs and kisses. Soon, they were the best of friends. Once Helen was settled in the guest room, the children were allowed to go up and see her. Katy noticed at once that the room looked different. Somehow it seemed prettier than before. Aunt Izzy always kept the house clean and tidy, but it was never pretty. Katy admired a lovely white vase on the mantelpiece. It was Helen's favorite ornament. She took it with her everywhere. Katy ran outside to pick the loveliest flowers in the garden. She gave them to Helen, who arranged them in the white vase. The children spent many happy hours in Helen's room. She was so good at storytelling, and she knew all sorts of games. Even Aunt Izzy and Papa joined in the fun. The children grew to love Helen. Katy liked nothing more than to sit with her once her brothers and sisters had gone to bed. They talked and talked about all sorts of things. All too soon, it was time for Helen to leave. She was going away for a holiday. Before she went, she gave everyone a farewell present. There were toys and books for the younger children, a notebook for Papa, and a brooch for Aunt Izzy. As for Katy, she gasped with delight when Helen gave her a white vase, exactly like her own. "I shall keep it forever," she cried. "If you do, it will be the first thing you've ever kept for more than a week without breaking it," remarked Aunt Izzy. As she waved goodbye to Helen, Katy had to brush away the tears from her eyes. "I will try to be good like Helen," she thought, "and I shall start tomorrow." But when tomorrow came, Katy didn't feel like being good. As she was brushing her hair, her elbow knocked against the precious white vase. It fell to the floor and broke into 100 pieces. Katy burst into tears. "You clumsy child," cried Aunt Izzy. "And fancy crying like a baby at your age," she added crossly. Then she told Katy to tidy her drawer before going downstairs to play. "And you are not to play on the new swing today," she continued. The new swing had just been put up in the woodshed, but it wasn't fastened properly at the top. Perhaps Aunt Izzy should have explained this to Katy. Katy thought Aunt Izzy very unkind to make her stay indoors on such a lovely morning, but she tidied her drawer as she had been told. Then she raced downstairs. Elsie was just coming up to see Katy. "Look," she said, "I've written a letter to Helen. Now I'm going to post it." This made Katy even more upset. She wanted to be the first to write to Helen. "I don't care about your stupid letter," she said, giving Elsie an impatient push. Elsie slipped, screamed, and fell down the stairs. Aunt Izzy came running into the hall. "Katy pushed me," sobbed Elsie. "She's a naughty, wicked girl." "Well, Katy Carr," cried Aunt Izzy, "you should be ashamed of yourself. What would Helen think of you?" The thought of Helen made Katy even more miserable. She ran outside so that Aunt Izzy shouldn't see the tears that were welling up in her eyes. As she passed the woodshed, Katy caught sight of the new swing. Trust Aunt Izzy to spoil her fun. Why shouldn't she play on the new swing today? So Katy sat on the smooth wooden seat. Holding the thick new ropes, she pushed gently with her toes. The swing lifted her up into the air, and she swung backwards and forwards. It was a wonderful feeling. Her hair fanned out in the breeze. She felt peaceful and dreamy. The swing lifted her higher and higher. All of a sudden, the swing gave a violent twist. It spun round, tossing Katy into the air. She tried to clutch the rope, but felt herself falling down, down, down. Then, everything went black. When at last she opened her eyes, Katy was lying on the sofa in the dining room. Clover was kneeling beside her. She looked pale and frightened. Aunt Izzy was pressing something cold and wet on Katy's forehead. "What happened?" gasped Katy in a faint voice. Her throat felt very dry. "Oh, she's alive! She's alive!" sobbed Clover, throwing her arms around Katy's neck. "Hush, dear," said Aunt Izzy. Her voice sounded unusually gentle. "You've had a bad tumble, Katy. Do you remember the swing?" "Oh, yes, the swing," Katy repeated. "Did I fall off the new swing?" "It wasn't fastened properly," said Aunt Izzy. "Did you forget that I told you not to play on it today?" "No, Aunt Izzy, I didn't forget. But Katy couldn't say any more. She closed her eyes. Tears rolled from under the lids. "Please don't cry," whispered Clover. "Aunt Izzy won't scold you." But Katy was too weak and shaken not to cry. She tried to sit up, but found she couldn't move. When Dr. Carr came home, he was shocked to see Katy looking so ill. He felt her legs and her back. Then, he and Aunt Izzy carried her gently and carefully upstairs. Poor Katy. The pain in her back was dreadful. She lay in bed, unable to move. She was very hot and so uncomfortable. She had meant to go to paradise that afternoon with Clover. If only she hadn't gone on the swing. If only. But then, Katy must have fallen asleep. When she next opened her eyes, she could feel a lovely, cool breeze. Elsie was sitting by the bed, waving a palm leaf fan. Katy started to say something, but began to cry instead. "Poor Katy," whispered Elsie. "Is it terribly sore?" "It isn't that," sobbed Katy. "I've been so horrid to you. Please forgive me for pushing you." At once, Elsie hugged Katy, and the two sisters kissed each other. Later that day, Papa brought another doctor to see Katy. The doctor spent a long time examining her. When at last he had finished, he told Katy that she would have to stay in bed for at least a week, possibly longer. Papa looked very worried. He bent over Katy and kissed her hot forehead. "You must learn to be patient, my darling," he said quietly. Katy couldn't reply. She just lay there, trying to hold back the tears. Katy lay in bed, counting the days to the end of the week. But when at last 7 days had gone by, she was no better. When she tried to sit up, it hurt so much that she was glad to sink back against the soft pillows. Then, instead of getting better, the pain became a great deal worse. Katy didn't know it at the time, but she was very ill indeed. Aunt Izzy was often up most of the night, looking after her. The other children tiptoed around the house. There were times when Katy didn't know whether it was day or night, or even whether she was asleep or awake. Then, one day, the pain did not seem so bad. Katy opened her eyes. Was the nightmare over at last? "How long have I been ill?" she asked Papa, who was at her bedside. "It's 4 weeks since your fall," he replied. "As long as that? And when can I get up and go downstairs again?" she asked. Her father looked very grave. "Your back will take a long time to get better, I'm afraid," he said, "but you are young and strong, and it will get better. Think of poor Helen. You must be brave as she is. She will never walk again." Katy buried her face in Papa's chest. "Oh, Papa, Papa," she sobbed. "If only I had listened to Aunt Izzy. I wish I could be brave like Helen." Then she wept as if her heart would break. Now that Katy knew she wasn't going to get better for a long, long time, she felt thoroughly miserable. The family tried to cheer her up, but Katy's unhappiness made her selfish and thoughtless. Aunt Izzy ran up and downstairs all day and was always trying to please her. But Katy never said, "Thank you," and she never noticed how tired Aunt Izzy looked. She didn't even want Cece or her sisters and brothers to come and see her. It only made her feel worse to hear about all the fun they were having downstairs or outside in the sunshine. She refused to let the sun into her room. It only made her feel more miserable. So, she lay alone in her gloomy bedroom, not speaking to anyone and not wanting to do anything. But the nights were worse. Once everyone else was asleep, Katy would lie awake, crying helplessly for hours on end. All her plans would run through her head, all the beautiful things she wanted to do when she was grown up. "And now I shall never do anything at all except lie here," she would say to herself. "Papa says I shall get better, but I know I won't. It's so awful." Then she would weep and weep until morning. No wonder she was so short-tempered every day. One morning, a letter arrived from Helen. She was on her way home from her holiday, but didn't think she should stay with the Carrs this time. Aunt Izzy would be too busy looking after Katy. When Katy heard this, she begged Papa and Aunt Izzy to invite Helen to stay, if only for one night. Papa said it would mean too much work for Aunt Izzy. But Aunt Izzy knew how happy Katy would be to see her cousin, so she said, "Yes." For the first time in her life, Katy threw her arms around Aunt Izzy's neck and kissed her. When Helen arrived, she was shocked to see Katy's sad, pale face. Katy's eyes were red and swollen from so much crying, and she had become quite thin. But, oh, how happy she was to see her cousin. They kissed and talked for a little while. Then, Helen asked if the blinds could be pulled up. "It's so dark and dismal in here," she said. "Does the sunlight hurt your eyes, my dear?" Katy replied that she hated to see the sun. It only reminded her of the lovely times she used to have. Helen thought hard for a minute. Then she turned to Katy. "Listen to me, Katy," she said in a serious voice. "You are going to get better one day. You know that, don't you?" "Yes," replied Katy, "but it's going to be such a long time to wait, and I wanted to do so many things. Now I can't do any of them." "What sort of things did you want to do?" asked Helen. Katy told her that she had wanted to be famous and to be loved and admired by everyone, and she had promised Mama to take care of her brothers and sisters. Helen told her that there were plenty of things she could still do. First of all, her sick room should be a bright, pretty place, full of sunshine and fresh flowers. The old medicine bottles, which cluttered up the mantelpiece, should be put away. Then, Helen brushed Katy's tangled hair and promised to send her a pretty dressing gown instead of the rather plain one she was wearing. "Each day you must think, 'Soon I will be better.' But, in the meantime, I must make my sick room pretty so that everyone will want to share it with me. Then, you must always be ready to welcome your sisters and brothers when they come to see you. Be interested in what everyone else is doing or thinking. Then, they will come to you whenever they want to talk or to ask advice." Helen also made Katy promise to do 2 hours schoolwork each day so that she wouldn't fall so far behind the others. When Papa came to take Helen to her room, Katy promised to remember everything Helen had told her. That night, she slept peacefully for the first time since her fall. 2 long months passed. Katy still had to lie in bed all the time, but she tried to look forward to each new day and to be happy for her family's sake. Her room was always cheerful and cozy, even on a cold winter's day. Outside, the snow was falling, but in Katy's room, a fire burned brightly in the grate. Soon it would be Christmas. It was decided that the children should hang up their stockings in Katy's room. Then she wouldn't miss any of the fun. Katy had made a list of the presents she wanted to give to the family, but she couldn't go to the shops, and she didn't have enough money. So she asked Aunt Izzy for help. To her delight, Aunt Izzy gave her a $5 note. "This is your Christmas present," she explained, "but perhaps you would like it now." "How good you are," exclaimed Katy, beaming with pleasure. Aunt Izzy was always so kind and gentle these days. Katy gave Aunt Izzy her list and the money. The next day, Aunt Izzy returned from town, laden with parcels. Katy spent a happy afternoon wrapping everything up. On Christmas Eve, the children hung up their stockings. Katy couldn't help wishing that someone would pin up a stocking for her. Later, Katy helped Papa and Aunt Izzy to fill the stockings. The toes were stuffed with candy and oranges. Then came the parcels, all shapes and sizes, wrapped in white paper and tied with brightly colored ribbon. The next morning, Phil was at Katy's bedside, shaking her awake. "Merry Christmas," he cried. "Look what Santa Claus has brought." Katy rubbed her eyes and gasped with delight. Next to her bed was the most beautiful little Christmas tree she had ever seen. Its branches were hung with oranges and shiny red apples. There were baskets of nuts and strings of bright berries and small parcels tied with satin ribbon. "What a beautiful Christmas tree," exclaimed Katy. "We all helped to decorate it," explained Clover. "But haven't you noticed what it's standing on?" Katy looked. She saw a rather curious chair. It had a long cushioned back and a footstool attached at the front. This was Papa's present to Katy. Soon, she would be well enough to sit in it. It was a wonderful Christmas. The children declared it to be the best ever. Katy couldn't quite agree with them, but she had certainly enjoyed herself. It was several weeks before Katy was well enough to use the new chair. Aunt Izzy would dress her in the morning and slide her off the bed onto the chair. Then she would wheel her over to the window. Every movement was painful, but it was marvelous to be able to sit up and look outside. Katy could see the sky and the trees and watch the people go by in the street. With each day, she grew brighter and more cheerful. So, the weeks and months slipped by. When summer came, the days were long and hot. The heat made Katy feel very uncomfortable. How she longed to run into the cool shade under the poplar trees. It was now a whole year since her fall. Would she ever be well again? One day, Papa took her for a drive, thinking that she would enjoy going out for a change. But the ride was so bumpy, and it was so painful being lifted in and out of the carriage that she couldn't bear to do it again. At last, September came. It brought a fresh breeze, smelling of pine woods and cool hilltops. Katy began to feel much better. She even asked Papa if she could have French lessons. So, the French teacher came to her room twice a week. Katy worked very hard and became one of his best pupils. She always tried to be cheerful, but she dreaded the dismal winter days that lay ahead. Then, something happened that was to change her life. Aunt Izzy had not been feeling well. Papa said that she must stay in bed for a few days. It seemed strange not to see her bustling about the house, in charge of everything. Katy missed her dreadfully. She was so used to having her there whenever she needed anything. One day, Papa looked very worried. He told Katy that Aunt Izzy had a serious illness called typhoid fever. She needed plenty of rest and peace and quiet. It was an anxious time for the family. The children couldn't wait for Aunt Izzy to get better. It never occurred to them that she might not get better. Then one morning, Katy woke to find Mary, the maid, at her bedside. Mary was crying quietly. Aunt Izzy had died in the night. The children wept in one another's arms. What would they do without Aunt Izzy to look after them? For the next few weeks, the house was sad and gloomy. Papa said they would have to find a housekeeper, but Katy hated the thought of a stranger coming to live with them. "I shall be housekeeper," she cried. "I can organize everything from my bedroom. Oh, please say yes, Papa. It would give me something really important to do." Papa didn't think that Katy would be able to manage, but he agreed to let her try. At first, Katy was always worrying that the children weren't eating properly or that the house wasn't clean enough. But after a few ups and downs, Papa saw that things seemed to be running smoothly. So, Katy remained in charge of the household from that day on. Time passed, and it was now 2 years since Aunt Izzy had died. Katy was just like a mother to her sisters and brothers. Her room was everyone's favorite place, full of fresh flowers and pretty things. Although she still couldn't walk, Katy didn't have to sit in her chair all day. Instead, she had a wheelchair. She could move around her room and fetch things without always having to ask for help. Clover was growing up too. She was quite a young lady now. Her thick brown hair was pinned up instead of hanging in 2 plaits, and her dresses, like Katy's, were always neat and tidy. Then one day, Elsie and Clover were startled to hear Katy crying out. She sounded very excited about something, so they rushed up to her room at once. To their astonishment, they found Katy standing up, holding onto her wheelchair. "Look at me," cried Katy. "I suddenly felt that I could stand up if I really tried, And I can. Papa, Papa, shrieked Clover. Come and see Katy. Dory, John, Phil, come quickly. The rest of the family crowded into the room. Papa could hardly believe his eyes. This is marvelous, my dear, he cried, but you must be careful not to overdo things. Sit down now and have a rest. He helped Katy to sit back in her wheelchair. Oh, Papa, she gasped, her voice trembling with excitement. Shall I be able to walk again soon? Yes, my dear, replied Papa. I'm sure that you will soon be completely better, but it may take a little longer. You must be patient. The next day, Katy stood up again, and this time, she took a step forward. Elsie and Clover kept close to her in case she should fall. In the weeks that followed, Katy's legs became stronger and stronger. Soon, she could take several steps at once, pushing a chair along in front of her. At last, she was able to move without leaning on the chair. For the first time in 4 long years, she walked out of her bedroom. How marvelous it felt! She noticed all the changes that had taken place, a new bookshelf in Phil's room, some pretty curtains in Elsie's room. Everywhere seemed fresh and new. Can I go downstairs now, Papa? She asked one day. I'm sure my legs are strong enough. But Papa said she must wait a little longer. Then Clover had an idea. Why don't we have a family celebration on the day Katy comes downstairs? Everyone thought it was a splendid idea. Papa said Katy should be well enough to go downstairs in 10 days' time. Clover seemed to be very busy during the following week or so. She wanted the whole house to be spick and span for the big day. The younger children seemed to be sharing a secret. Katy could see that Phil was almost bursting with excitement about something. But she didn't want to spoil the fun, so she didn't ask any questions. On the day before the celebration, Clover asked Katy to keep her bedroom door closed. We have to sweep the hall, she explained. And you don't want dust in your room, do you? Katy's big day dawned, at last. She put on a pretty, new dress. It was a present from Papa. Her sisters had new dresses, too. How nice we all look, cried Elsie. Papa took Katy's arm. Very slowly, they made their way downstairs. Let's go into the parlor, said Papa. You need to rest now, my dear. Papa opened the parlor door. Katy took one step forward, then stopped. She held onto the doorknob. Her face was flushed. For one awful moment, Papa thought she was going to faint. Then, she took a step forward and almost ran across the room. Cousin Helen, she gasped. She almost threw herself down by the sofa where her cousin lay. The two hugged each other, laughing and crying at the same time. Wasn't it a nice surprise? Cried Phil, jumping up and down in great excitement. Katy had never felt so happy. How lucky she was to have such a wonderful family. This was the best day of her life. As long as she lived, she would never forget it. The end. Thank you for watching.